Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome. Oh, yes, I know the call and response, right? So I'm Angela Nwachi-Willig, Dean of Boston University School of Law and the inaugural Thank you, Ron. And the inaugural Gallo Professor of Law, the first endowed professorship in the field of critical race theory in the United States. Apropos of the discussion today, I'm delighted to welcome all of you, including those of you who are joining us virtually, to our annual Distinguished Lecture. The annual Distinguished Lecture is a BU law tradition dating back to the 1980s. Previous distinguished lecturers include preeminent legal scholars such as Professors Cass Sunstein, David Cole, Heather Gerken, Harold Coe, Randall Kennedy, Carol Sanger, Richard Posner, Martha Minow, and most recently, Melissa Murray. In addition to delivering the annual distinguished lecture, each speaker's remarks appear in a subsequent edition of the Boston University Law Review. And today it's my honor to introduce Guy-Uriel Charles, the Charles Ogletree Jr. Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and faculty director of its Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice. I've known Professor Charles for more than 2 decades, having met him when he was an upper class student and I was a frightened 1L at the University of Michigan Law School. And he was to blame for part of that frightening with his scary stories. So I'm really pleased to welcome him here to BU Law. Today, Professor Charles will speak on the topic of critical race theory. 30 years since its inception, critical race theory has emerged into the public consciousness as one of the most polarizing issues in our contemporary politics. Professor Charles will argue the public backlash against critical race theory reflects a shift in power dynamics and the transition to a multiracial democracy in which demand for equal political power clashes against systemic structures premised on political power clashes against systemic structures premised on the unequal distribution of political power. I'm out of my element today. Professor Charles teaches and writes about election law, race and law, constitutional law, and civil procedure. He's published numerous articles in prestigious law journals like the Michigan Law Review and Georgetown Law Journal. He is a co-author of Election Law in the American Political System and Racial Justice and Law, Cases and Materials, and co-editor of The New Black, What Has Changed and What Has Not with Race in America, and of Race, Reform, and Regulation of the Electoral Process, Recurring Puzzles in American Democracy. He is currently co-authoring a book on voting rights and the Voting Rights Act entitled The American Promise, Rethinking Voting Rights and Policy for a Divided America. Professor Charles received his JD from the University of Michigan Law School and clerked for the Honorable Judge Damon Keith of the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, a legend among judges. While at the University of Michigan, he was one of the founders and was the first editor-in-chief of the Michigan Journal of Race and Law. Prior to joining Harvard's law faculty, Professor Charles spent more than a decade on the faculty at Duke Law, where he was the Edward and Ellen Schwartzman Professor of Law, and where he co-founded the Center on Law, Race, and Politics. Before teaching at Duke, Professor Charles taught at the University of Minnesota Law School from 2000 to 2009. He later served as interim co-dean from 2006 to 2008. And Professor Charles has been a visiting professor at Georgetown, Virginia, and Columbia Law Schools. A past member of the National Research Commission on Elections and Voting and the Century Foundation Working Group on Election Reform, Professor Charles has served as director of the Institute for Law and Politics, a senior fellow in law and politics at the Institute on Race and Poverty, and a faculty affiliate at the Center for the Study of Political Psychology at the University of Minnesota. Professor Charles has received numerous distinguished teaching awards from the University of Minnesota Law School and Duke Law School. You're in for a major treat, and it's my great honor to introduce Professor Guy-Uriel Charles.
Thank you so much. It is a distinguished honor to be here this afternoon, to be introduced by really person who turns out to be my classmate and a leader in the profession. In many ways, Angela, we've always looked up to you, even when we were law students, to have friends and colleagues here. This is actually my second time coming to BU Law. My first was yesterday. But I have a number of friends and colleagues at this law school. Kathy Zeiler, who issued the invitation. I first met her when I did a short visit at Georgetown. And not only is she brilliant, we tried to recruit her when I was just talking to her about that in the elevator, reminding her in the elevator, which I guess she probably will want to forget. But we tried to recruit her when I was at Minnesota. But not only is she brilliant, but she also gave me some of the best running advice that I will never forget. So she was kind to a visitor and thoughtful and engaging, and I am forever grateful to her and grateful to all of you for being here, former classmates in this room, and for engaging in what will be some initial inchoate thoughts. So this is a roadshow of some ideas that has been percolating for a little bit, and I'm curious and receptive to your feedback, and the more critical, the more that I think I will enjoy it. So sometime around 2020, and I don't remember exactly when, to be honest with you, I read an article which may have come to my attention on Twitter. I'm more of a lurker than anything else. And the article was about a controversy brewing over critical race theory. And the controversy was over the contention that CRT was being taught to young kids, and that this was deeply problematic. My first reaction, quite frankly, was denial. Was like, no, that just cannot, this is wrong, that cannot be the case. Not critical race theory, like not our critical race theory, like the critical race theory of articles that we read that are like, 80 pages long, and half the time, none of us can really understand what they really mean. Right, so like not our critical race theory, not critical race theory that really in many ways died out of the law schools and were pushed out of the law schools many years ago, though apparently found some life outside of legal institutions. How can that critical race theory be so controversial and really being taught to young kids, and what in the world does that mean? I thought critical race theory to be niche. It's sort of like, I was talking to a group of students yesterday and said it would be similar to like a whole argument and a cultural moment over like proximate cause or the eggshell plaintiff, right? I think lawyers would be looking at that going, wait a minute, like we're fighting over proximate cause and storming school buildings over proximate cause. I mean, that's kind of like how I understood the fight over critical race theory. Denial for me gave way to reality, and which I had to engage and think about the fact that there really was this public backlash against CRT. And as I will note in a moment, the backlash is not really about CRT, or in some respects, not that much about race directly. And what I think you all know and see is that there's actually so much thrown in. There's genders thrown in, sexual orientation is thrown in, religion is thrown in, everything is thrown in some respects, CRT is a convenient starting point, a shorthand phrase, a cultural term of art, a political signifier. And the question is, what is it signifying? What is the cultural moment that it is representing? And I'll return to that in a moment. But for now, I'll refer to this as the CRT panic and try to take it on its own terms. The reality, whether fair or not, unjust or distorted, accurate or not, CRT is now identifiable as a divisive cultural issue. And so much of our debate about race and identity are thrown into this understanding, this thing now that has been called critical race theory. I was so curious that I decided to teach a seminar entitled Critical Race Theory and Its Critics, to both try to think about and go back and reread some of the things that I've been reading and teaching over the years, to read about the controversy, and then to try to think about what it means and how to respond and work our way through it. And to get to the punchline, I will end by saying, from my perspective, the fight is really a fight about the fact that for the first time, really, the US finds itself in a moment in which it is trying to define itself as a multiracial, multicultural polity, where the power structures are very different. The basic underlying assumptions are very different. So every group is now at the table, and every group is making a claim that they belong. So it's no longer white people versus Black people. It is white, Black, Latino, Asian, Native American, and multiracial, multicultural, and everything in between. It is no longer a question of gender. It's a question of gender and non-gender and different gender identities. It's no longer a question of religion. It's a question of religion, non-religion, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, whatever your particular religious identity is. It's no longer really about region in a way that's so defined, north and south, maybe east and west. In many respects, it is about the particular small location in which you find yourself. It is really no longer about partisanship. Right? So it is about Republican versus Democrat, and Democrat versus Republican, but different flavors of Republicanism and different flavors of what it means to be a Democrat, or different ideologies. What is the conception of conservatism? And you see the conservatives fighting against one another. You see the liberals, center left, fighting against one another, the cultural versus the economic. It is about a different understanding of the political and economic system, in which now every conception of identity is at the table and trying to fight for its understanding and its place of the polity and its share of power and distribution and political power. That moment is terrifying, and I think it's terrifying for all. And as I will say towards the end, a lot of the issues that we thought we had put to rest are now back for reconsideration and renegotiation. And it is finding its way in this expression of critical race theory as cultural signifier. So the reality is that whether we like it or not, this is the moment in which we live in. And so it has seemed that every week there is another story about a group of parents yelling at one another and yelling at some hapless school board about critical race theory, where the school board members are sitting looking absolutely dumbfounded, and people are standing and saying, this is my country and you can't do this to my kids. You're indoctrinating them. You're making them feel badly about themselves. For example, in June of last year, Sam Metz for the Associated Press reported, Nevada has become the latest flashpoint in a national debate over how to teach students about racism and its role in US history, with parents clashing over curriculum proposals. People wore MAGA hats and waved signs outside a packed school board meeting this week in Reno, while trustees considered expanding K-5 curriculum to include more teaching about equity, diversity, and racism. Opponents say the proposal would lead to the teaching of critical race theory, which seeks to reframe the narrative of American history. Critics say such lesson plans teach students to hate the United States. Right? These are the terms, at least on one side of the debate. The fear, I think, is evident, palpable, some of which is manufactured, but doesn't make it any less real. So here's another headline from a Texas Tribune article from December of last year: death threats and doxing, the outcomes of mask mandates and critical race theory fights at a Texas school board. Brian Lopez, the reporter of that article, wrote, "The sharp divide in Fort Worth can be traced back to a particular heated late June school board meeting over so-called critical race theory that stretched a two-hour meeting to nearly 5 hours." Here's yet another story from CNN by Kyun La and Jack Hanna. Clutching a page of notes, Bob Russo sat in the middle of the boisterous audience in the school gymnasium, reviewing what he wanted to tell the Douglas County School Board members. When it was his turn to speak, Russo stood and approached the microphone. "I don't know about you, but I don't want Marxist blood in this country," he said, generating widespread applause. This was Russo's third school board meeting in 8 days. Mr. Russo clearly has a bit of time. Officials were holding town halls across from the rural Northwest Nevada County to address concerns roiling the community, such as whether students were learning critical race theory in classrooms or whether children should wear masks or get vaccines to protect them from COVID. "I'm concerned about the kids being taught theories, ideologies that are going to divide them and set them apart from each other," Russo said to CNN in an interview. "I'm concerned about our freedom." It's pretty clear how existential in some ways the fight is in all quarters. I think many across the board, no matter where it is that they're coming from, see this question of one as freedom, about what kids are being taught, about the meaning of the United States, about their own identities, about how to understand the things, the stories, and the histories that they are processing. So school board meetings seems to be the flashpoint. And these moments, which were once mind-numbingly boring, and in many respects, often inconsequential, they were once under the radar. They've now become cultural flashpoints. So as Daniel Payne of Politico wrote in September of 2021, frustrations over how kids are taught about systemic racism have turned once sleepy school board elections into hyper-local skirmishes with the power to polarize how a new generation learns about US history. These frustrations aren't contained by just screaming and venting. They have culminated in political action and in legislation. They are now really and deeply consequential. By my count, there are at least 10 states that have CRT bans or race bans: Arizona, Arkansas, Idaho, Iowa, New Hampshire, North Dakota, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas, and another 20 or so that have bills pending. So take the bill from Alabama as one example, where the school board in Alabama has already issued an administrative order regulating the teaching of race and CRT in schools. The board had promulgated an administrative rule that says that you can't indoctrinate students in certain social or political ideologies. Now, I think, quite frankly, that's fascinating from an educational perspective, because you would ask, look, what is it that education is doing, right? But we will leave that aside for the moment, and you can explore it in the Q&A if one wants. One of the bills pending before the legislature would, by its own description, prohibit, and here I'm quoting, public K through 12 schools and public institutions of higher education from teaching certain concepts regarding race, sex, such as critical race theory specifically. It would also prohibit a K through 12 school or public education of higher education, and again quoting, from imposing a penalty upon or discriminating against a student on account of his or her refusal to support, believe, endorse, embrace, confess, act upon, or otherwise assent to divisive concepts, such as critical race theory. And of course, in like a good proposed bill and legislation, it tries to define what it means by divisive, though from my perspective, without much clarity. So we know that these issues are not just about venting and protesting, that they are consequential and result in legislation. And some certainly believe that they are relevant to a change of political power. So for example, there's an argument that the anti-CRT fervor swung the Virginia gubernatorial election from Terry McAuliffe, who was widely expected to run away with it without even looking back in Usain Bolt fashion, to Glenn Youngkin. Youngkin certainly ran an anti-CRT campaign, and his surprising win has been attributed to that campaign and the backlash against CRT, though some dispute that to be the case, including folks on the left. Now, whatever one may think about the cause of Youngkin's victory, certainly I think we're all aware of last week's San Francisco school board elections. I don't think that can be dismissed as not related to the whole CRT backlash. Some members of the school board were removed following a recall. So here's a story by Laura Meckler that appeared in the Washington Post last week. Voters in San Francisco overwhelmingly ousted 3 school board members from their positions Tuesday in a move fueled by a failure to reopen schools last year and unpopular actions aimed at advancing racial justice. The recall is the latest signal that voters, even in a liberal city like San Francisco, have grown frustrated with public schools during the coronavirus pandemic, education, particularly its struggles with the virus measures and racial issues, is expected to play a prominent role in elections across the country this year. The results in San Francisco are another warning sign for Democrats. A couple of things that are worth noting here. One is, it is tempting to frame these questions purely in partisan terms. Right, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a moment. Clearly, there is a partisan valence, and there's no doubt that there's an ideological valence, right? But there may be respects in which these questions straddle a little bit more our partisan divide, that the polarization is not purely partisan, though it may be overwhelmingly so. It is also tempting to frame these questions along exact racial lines, white versus non-white, white versus Black, et cetera. But when you actually look at some of the parents, look at some of the issues, there are Black people in some of these school board meetings saying, CRT is from the devil. And I know, because I'm a Black person, I have the epistemic authority to tell you. I actually think that's actually a very interesting meta CRT type of a point, right? Claiming epistemic authority on the basis of race to get rid of CRT, kind of like mind-blowing if you actually know what CRT is. But leaving that aside for the moment, right? But I think it complicates the questions of viewing these simply in pure race terms. It's also interesting the way that this moment, the CRT panic, also mixes with our questions and where we find ourselves during the middle of the pandemic, right? Sort of these issues in which there's so much anxiety over, right? Sort of a mixture of a different sets of anxieties come together. And so a lot of these stories you hear both about the pandemic and school closures or masks around the pandemic and racial equity questions, and the way in which those two things have been linked together, either from an ideological perspective or from a partisan perspective. And the story of the San Francisco School Board Meckler does go on to briefly talk about the closures during the pandemic, but emphasizes and spends a good part of her article attributing the cause of the recall efforts to race and CRT. So she writes, at the same time, the board engaged in moves aimed at advancing racial equity that critics say were divisive and ill-advised, particularly for a period when schools were closed and academic and emotional damage to the city's children was accruing. For instance, the board spent months deliberating the renaming of 44 schools after a committee found their namesakes and connections to slavery, oppression, racism. Although many of the alleged ties were thin, or in some cases historically questionable or inaccurate, those targeted included George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and citing a single incident from the 1980s, even longtime Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein, right? You've crossed the line when you've gone after Dianne Feinstein, right? And you've tried to cancel her. How dare you, right? So there is a way in which, and I think this article represents some interesting and important insights. One, in thinking about what are the types of stories and monuments and remembrances around which we want to build our identity, right? And what are the limits? So Abraham Lincoln, really? George Washington, how should we think about, and for goodness sakes, right, DeFi or DiFi, I don't know what the current name is, right? There's a question as to what extent then is this impending regime that is attempting to replace the ancien regime, right, has no limitations, a la, think of this one way to, perhaps not a great way to think about it, from the French Revolution perspective, right? So there's these deep questions about identity, history, and limits. So we can begin to articulate some reasons why CRT has become so controversial, and I'll structure them more soon. But certainly, if you followed this debate recently, you would think that I would be remiss in not naming and saying the name Chris Rufo. Rufo is a self-styled journalist, conservative activist, who has made it his personal mission to attack, and I think one could legitimately say, by his own admission as well, distort CRT. Now, he's a prime mover, but I'll note in a moment, I think he is more of an opportunist than anything else. In one of his many articles on critical race theory, this one published in the Wall Street Journal, Rufo writes, critical race theory is the latest battleground in the culture war. Since the murder of George Floyd last year, critical race theory's key concepts, including systemic racism, white privilege, white fragility, have become ubiquitous in America's elite institutions. Progressive politicians have sought to implement anti-racist policies that to reduce racial disparities, such as minorities-only income programs and racially segregated vaccine distribution. I'm not trying to be rude, I'm just trying to make sure that I don't bore you for too long. I don't mind boring you for 30 minutes, but 2 hours might be pushing it. It's kind of like trying to cancel Dianne Feinstein. Rufo, I think, brings a number of points here that are worth thinking through. The first, and I'll note in a moment, is the tie between George Floyd and the racial reckoning, with a number of movements that have attempted to try to understand that moment. And as I'll note too in a second, tying together things that may not belong, but also an understanding that the culture war and the culture war on critical race theory is being fought in a number of different domains, with the combatants controlling some institutions and other combatants other institutions, and then some terrain that are completely up for grabs, right? So he talks about the fact that progressive politics, these ideas have become ubiquitous in America's elite institutions, right? So like these things that we, from his perspective, right, the we is him and his acolytes, do not control, but are controlled and being imposed upon us by the elites from the outside. And he continues on to say that the ideology has sparked an immense backlash. That's a very interesting way of putting it, because he's been an important player in sparking that backlash. You might say that he is the spark. As Americans have sought to understand critical race theory, they have discovered that it has divided Americans into racial categories of oppressor and oppressed, and promotes radical concepts such as spirit murder, what public schools supposedly do to Black children, and abolishing whiteness, a purported precondition for social justice in the class. In the classroom, critical race theory inspired lessons that have often devolved into race-based struggle sessions, with public schools forcing children to rank themselves according to a racial hierarchy, subjecting white teachers to anti-racist therapy and encouraging parents to become white traitors. Critical race theory, Rousseau goes on to state, is a radical ideology that seeks to use race as a means of moral, social, and political revolution. The left-leaning media has sought to portray it as a lens for examining the history of racism in the US, but the soft framing obscures the nature of the theory, which maintains that America is an irredeemably racist nation and that the constitutional principles of freedom and equality are mere camouflages. Now, one impulse, and in all candor, that was my initial impulse, is to push back against this redefinition and this distortion, and to say, this is not what critical race theory is. Right? And if you look at the early articles responding to this backlash, it's what a lot of people did. No, this isn't critical race theory. And then they would give various definitions of critical race theory, a lot of which actually I think were roughly inaccurate. But they would attempt to redefine it and say, no, this critical race theory is not that. Critical race theory is this. It's this good thing, not this bad thing. And Ruffo's definition of those of his acolytes truly describe a theoretical approach that is often unrecognizable and foreign to those of us who study CRT, and particularly those who write about CRT. And so Ellie Krasny of the Heritage Foundation writes that critical race theory is a theoretical framework rooted in Marxism that posits individuals as oppressed or oppressor based on their skin color. Critical race theory does not seek equality or justice. Instead, it categorizes people, one's race, gender, sexual orientation, posits you as the oppressor or oppressor, a status from which you are freed only when all existing societal structures, which are inherently racist, are overthrown. And one can find many more examples, right? Sort of they mix a little bit of truth, mix a bunch of other things. And it's also very clear that the anti-CRT forces are explicit that their goal is to distort, and to distort in a way that would make CRT unpalatable and as unpalatable as possible, right? So their goal is to create this cultural signifier. So in a statement that is often quoted, Ruffo tweeted and said, "We have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all the various cultural insanities under that brand category," right? You don't want, it's right there, like on the whole Twitter thingy, right? Where like goes out to the whole world saying, hey, this is the goal. And the goal is to make it toxic and to put all of these things together. And so when you look, in fact, it is an amalgamation of, right, what is now being culturally signified as critical race theory is an amalgamation of a lot of different things. It is a little bit of original critical race theory, right? Derek Bell gets thrown in. It is BLM, Black Lives Matter. It is Nicole Hannah-Jones's 1619 project, right? It is Dr. Ibram Kendi's How to Be Anti-Racist project. It is Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. It is diversity and inclusion, DEI work, right? It's sort of like a whole bunch of 5, 6, 7 different things thrown under the banner of critical race theory, and all sorts of distortions are included precisely towards the goal, right? And so it is tempting and in some senses infuriating, but it's tempting to say this isn't what it is. What it is, at least from my perspective, I take three core insights from critical race theory. First, at its most basic and reductionist, critical race theory is about race. It is about understanding the importance of race in American society. Second, it is about racism and the conception that racism is not exceptional or accidental. Racism is not the product of a bad actor. It is not about feelings. It is about individuals. Racism is systematic and structural and the outcome of socio-political arrangements. Third, critical race theory is about law. Law is not neutral. Law constructs, law shapes, law constructs race, law facilitates subordination, law facilitates racial liberation. So for me, then, critical race theory really does mean those three things. We must pay attention to race and racial inequality. That is, if you don't, you can't fully explain and understand American society. By ignoring race, you will have explanations that are inaccurate or, in many cases, simply fundamentally wrong. Doesn't mean that you must always pay attention to race, but you can't blithely ignore it either. Second, for me, it means that you can't fully understand racial inequality unless you have a structural variable, right? You have to come to terms with structural dimensions. Individual bad actors or individual victims are easy to find, but they can also be a distraction if the goal is to address the root cause of the problem. So it's very easy to point to the police officer who placed his knee on the back of a Black man's neck, or the officer who reached for the gun instead of the taser, or the individuals who hunted down a Black man jogging on the street because they didn't think he belonged. Lots of bad actors with varying levels of culpability, although sometimes we try to assign the same level of culpability. But to get to the root of the problem, we have to think about the system that produced the individual police officer, or the structure that allowed individuals to see Black life as less than, right? Or the structure that produced the unequal outcome in the school system, or the prison system, or the employment, or the economic system. Third, law does have the power to ameliorate, to structure inequality, and it has the power to further entrench it. So in my view, critical race theory, and here's a controversial statement, is not congruent with diversity and inclusion work or white fragility for that matter. Right? Feelings and getting everybody in a room and to talk about education, from my perspective, is different than doing the different, right? Maybe not easier, maybe not harder, structural work to think about long-term entrenched outcomes. But nevertheless, all these things are thrown together, and the tendency is to retort that this is not CRT, and the version offered by Rufo and his allies are versions that are intended to distort, and to make this into a fight over definitions. And that temptation is strong, but I think must be resisted. Doesn't mean that correction is inappropriate, but it doesn't get at the deeper question. And so the deeper question, from my perspective, is about power. And it's about a moment in which the American political system is trying to grapple into a transitional society, the society in which one is trying to decide how now to apportion power, resources, burdens, when you have many more claimants to those resources. So, towards the end now, let me go to the summer of 2020, what was then called the racial reckoning. This was the period when the country was processing the spate of killings of Black people by the police, and as well as of Black people by civilians in the case of Ahmaud Arbery. In particular, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, the country seemed to come together to support racial justice and Black Lives Matter. People wanted an explanation and they wanted to understand what was happening. And so we had a multiracial protest. Now that multiracial protest did not last long, right? There was a backlash. Now, from the perspective of many, that backlash is similar to the types of backlash that we've had previously in the American context. But I want to suggest that this moment is in fact different, right? Because the prior backlash operated within a context in which the hierarchy was very clear, right? It was really white over Black, and we're fighting over limited territory. Now I think we're fighting over the whole terrain. And the protest of this moment and its backlash is indicative of something different, a shift in the hierarchy. So recall now the preamble to the Constitution: we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. I always return to the preamble because I think it presents a very arresting question. Who are we the people? And one that we are continuing to address, that we've been attempting to address for a couple hundred years. So for so long in this country, indeed, almost all of its history, we the people really has meant white people. It is our white people union. We want to ensure domestic tranquility to ourselves, for our common defense, for our general welfare, and to secure the blessings of liberty for our posterity. And it is our Constitution, and it is our United States. Because the Constitution was for defined in racial terms, race itself was a question that had to be managed, right? We were securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves. We can compromise on slavery. We can compromise on separate but unequal. We can compromise on lynchings. We can compromise on vigilantism. We can compromise on police killings. But I submit that between 2019, 2020, and 2021, something changed. It became evident that the claimants were different. It became evident that the power dynamics were up for grabs. It's interesting too, in this moment, you take a different type of signifier, the president of the United States or a candidate running for president and saying, I will appoint a Black woman to one of the highest positions of power. The claimants have changed. We the people no longer mean the white people. Race was no longer a question to be managed, but something that everyone had to reckon with. Chris Rufo, I think, understood that and attempted to hold on to the ancien regime and to use critical race theory as a way to prevent and stop the power shift. We do find ourselves in a moment of uncertainty where everything is up for grabs because we are trying to do something very different than we've ever done before, which is to try to create this multiracial, multicultural democracy. We are fighting over things that we thought were settled. What does racial equality mean? The court will soon tell us in the context of affirmative action and voting rights. How should we think about abortion? What constitutes religious liberty? Who belongs? Whose identities matter? Interestingly, the attempts to reinstate and think through these questions through the parameters of the old order, right? So we used to think about this from the perspective of federalism. What I find fascinating is that the place that is most divisive is that it's most local, which tells us that perhaps the structures that we've used in the past to try to resolve these questions may not do us as well as they've done previously because they've managed as opposed to really rethink equality and rethink equality for all. Critical race theory, I think, is an appropriate target because it is about upending the racial order. It is about recognition of subordination and an attempt to think through how to address subordination, which makes it the right target and the right fight and the right thing to debate over. It helps us to understand that race is indicative of a deeper problem. Right? This is the one insight Lonnie Guinier put on the table. Race is diagnostic. It helps us to understand that one solution is to try to struggle and figure out how we can expand the pie for everyone. So Rufo wants us to confine our identities to ever smaller and smaller categories, even as he's accusing critical race theorists of doing the same. But the truth of the matter is what critical race theory, I think, tries to do is to say, here's a particular structure. Here's how it doesn't work for everyone. How can we rethink that structure and to assure that all are equally represented? Right? Inclusion brings more people to the table. So what's so controversial about critical race theory? I think what's so controversial about critical race theory is its attempt to say American democracy belongs to all. And if we can flatten the hierarchy, then all of us will benefit. That, for all of our history, I think has been a controversial claim. I thank you for listening to these inchoate thoughts.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. So I totally agree with you. That doesn't matter, obviously, but I totally agree with you. And I'm just going to take your invitation to be a little critical about the account you're providing. And it's only that I'm wondering where this is in your account. The story and the reporting of all of the funding by conservative think tanks to upend the school board elections that started in 2016 and continue today. That is, where is the story in your account of the discrete, rich, conservative minority that is funding actually a so-called populist movement that you're describing? That just feels like a really important part of the story of anti-hierarchy that you're telling. And I'm wondering how it fits in the identity account that you're providing.
Thank you so much. So obviously, I think you've always been right, and you are right here as well, right? That is, I think that what I'm trying to tie together is the change in the power structure with identity. And so you're correct, understanding the funding structure and the exploitation, right, of identity for power, whether it's economic or political power purposes. But I think that's also part of the story that I'd like to tell, right? I don't think of it as simply a question about the relevance or irrelevance of identity. I want to think it through as the way that identity is being exploited for the maintenance of the status quo. And so the funding aspect of it, I hope, fits within the explanation that I'm providing. And I am serious about the invitation for criticism. These are initial thoughts. They're not fully, completely well-formed. And I think there are lots of places where they can be refined, right? And so perhaps, and leaving out the role that money is playing, that it doesn't allow us to have a complete story and to fit the relationship as well as it should. So I take that point, but I also think that it fits within that framework.
Let's go back and forth between the virtual audience and this audience. So this first question, the speaker appreciates your examples about how critics are making CRT toxic as a cultural signifier, and they're wondering, can you suggest how we can read criticisms of CRT to identify when the critic is trying to make it toxic?
Sure. So I don't know that I have any great answers to that question, because there's a part of me that thinks that given the level of polarization that we have in our society and the way that critical race theory is being exploited, right? So just to get to to go to the side from it and come back to the square of the question, I think many of us thought, myself included, we played this game for a long time, watching a lot of people talk about how much they hate critical race theory. And then people ask, well, how would you define it? Right. And I'm not talking about sort of like, your average school board person who's walking in. I'm talking about sort of like public intellectuals, right? What is critical race theory? Okay. Now, honestly, I think it's a really difficult question to talk about what is critical race theory, but I think it's fascinating to have a lot of people being opposed to something that they can't really define. Right. And so now then the question is it useful to be able to say, no, let me tell you what critical race theory is. It is really a good thing, and it is this thing as opposed to that thing. Okay, so what would be my preferred approach? I think my preferred approach, and here I come at this perhaps in a way that blinds me to other possibilities, because I come at this as a law and democracy scholar, right? In which, sort of like this is the old, if you have a hammer, everything is a nail, right? So as a law and democracy scholar, everything's a nail. And my hammer for all of my nails are, how can we restructure democratic politics in ways that makes it less zero sum and much more inclusive, right? How can we answer the types of felt needs that some people have? I think that's a tough and difficult question, but I do think for me, I think it's a possibility that holds more promise than the attempt to fight a definition battle and to try to say, hey, no, let's try to rephrase this. And maybe the social psychologists might be better at thinking through these questions, right? Where you might road test and focus group some different sets of messages. Interestingly, by the way, it's not clear that Rufo, certainly within people who are predisposed to accept his message, I think that these have made a lot of headways, but along people who are not predisposed, right, there's a different way of working through these questions. All right, so I think trying to redefine, I think that's an important strategy. That's an important way of thinking. Maybe it's better done by, say, the social psychologists and the political operatives, but from my perspective, it becomes harder because it's not clear that people fully understand exactly what they mean when they're talking about critical race theory. It's not clear that it matters at all to them whether they understand what it means, or it matters when they're talking about critical race theory. So I'm not sure that if we tried to say, hey, this is different, that it would make the headway with that audience that many of us would prefer, right? So let's fight about, one can fight about, and I've said a number of things that are controversial. For example, I've not included interest convergence as part of critical race theory, and I'm happy to fight about that. But it's not clear to me that trying to redefine might make it more palatable. Though again, I leave plenty of room to say I could be wrong about all 16, 20 things that I've said.
I have a question that I was reminded that a month ago I was starting to teach a class in American legal history, and I asked a question that I'd never asked before. I asked, can the United States be a multiracial democracy? It's the first time I ever thought of asking that question. I was embarrassed to ask that question because it was not a question. It was an easy answer. Of course, we are a multiracial democracy. I'm prompted to say this because I was thinking that I might have heard more about January 6th and changes to voting laws and changes to vote counting laws and changes to vote reporting laws and changes in who controls elections. So you're a great expert on election law. And I thought that was a real part of this story, that critical race theory has been identified as the opposition to an idea that there is a white supremacist basis of American democracy, that we now seem to have one political party. Well, we always had one political party who says it's a white supremacist democracy, but we switched political parties in 1964, and now we've got another political party that seems to be rallying to that same cry from Jim Crow days. Isn't that a whole dimension that you would identify as the same existential phenomenon, the same replacing a hierarchy with what phenomenon that's going on, but at the larger national political scale?
Yeah, no, I think yet another wonderful question. So here's the way that that I think about it. Certainly, I think January 6th and the questions of how to restructure American democracy, right? Questions that are, there are things that are on the table that weren't on the table before. So for example, we're talking about now the Electoral Count Act, right? We're talking about, I remember when I was in law school when Lonnie Grenier was talking about alternative voting structures, and those ideas were, where people were viewed them as completely foreign to American politics. Yet now we are engaged in those types of cumulative voting, alternative voting structures are on the lips of not all Americans, maybe not even most Americans, but they're not viewed as foreign in the way that they were before, right? So I completely agree that these are part of the rethinking set of questions. Now, I see and I may be again wrong about this, but I see the CRT panic obviously as predating right, sort of the culmination of January 6th, but very much related to the Obama presidency, very much related, quite frankly, to the Clinton presidency, right? I think that there are these cultural questions that may have been, some of which may have been brewing under the surface, that captured the imagination in particular moments, right? So, you could think of the first Obama presidency as the equivalent to the country's reaction post George Floyd, right? There's a moment in which everybody seems to want to say, okay, this is now who we are, right? And then all of a sudden there's a departure from that in relatively precipitous fashion, right? So I think January 6th is tied. I don't think it is something separate, right? But I do view the focus specifically on critical race theory, right? There's a ways in which 1619 was brought into this, but it ended up being around race itself. Or to put the point very differently, there's a way in which the black-white binary comes to be the core of the explanation, in a way that other types of explanations, such as how we think about political structures, right, are part of the story, but not the core of the story. And that's what I am struggling with, right? I'm struggling with articulating how race is the core of the story and how particularly Blackness is centered to even the core, right? If that's possible, though other things are part of it and related to.
One question from the virtual audience, and can you explain how CRT and DEI are opposing ideals?
Yeah, so I was hoping someone would ask me and force me to defend that position, which may be indefensible, but here we go, right? This is again road testing ideas. Okay, so I find it fascinating that when for most of at least the core legal scholars of critical race theory, right, the focus of their intervention is both about how do we understand law, how do we understand structures, how do we understand power from institutional perspectives. Okay, all right. So there's that on the one hand. All right. along from what I posit to be an analogous and different track, right, are efforts to think about attitudes, our effort to think about individuals, efforts to think about interrelationships, right? How individuals operate within their institutions, how they operate with each other, right? And attempts to educate and convince, right? So I view structure on one track, and then I view educative, individualized efforts on the other track. I place the critical race theory on the structure side for most of the academics, right? There maybe at least on the legal side, right? Leave aside the people who are doing critical race theory in education, who are essentially just trying to extend what they understand to be the legal framework, right? And I place DEI on the individual structure side. Okay. And if you were to ask, I think if you were to ask a militant CRT person, right? So leave aside ideology, leave aside partisanship, just on the basis of the theories, right? I think a militant CRT person would say, what is the stuff about education, or sort of like bring people in the room and giving them these tests, or trying to help them to understand their mental state, how they're relating to one another. No, I want structure, right? I want to think about institutions, right? That is the work of somebody else. So to lump them together, I think, right, here's the proposition, the controversial one, I think is a reflection from my perspective of really not understanding the core claim of critical race theory and what the goals that we want with DEI. It doesn't mean that, right, like that you shouldn't pursue structural goals or you shouldn't pursue DEI goals, but I don't think that they are as simpatico as we have assumed, or at least I'd like to question whether they are as simpatico as we sometimes assume that they are, right? So we've just sort of like, I don't think it's just Chris Rufo. I think we have all lumped CRT, DEI, and everything else under the sun. I don't know if that's right. And so part of it is trying to question whether those things are interrelated, or they can be exchanged one for the other, or whether they are on separate tracks. That's the proposition.
Thanks for the talk. It's really interesting. So I read a lot of the backlash against this, at least a part of it, as a fear about like the destruction of symbols. So you have like the ridiculous symbols, right? Like Confederate generals, but then you also have kind of more traditionally accepted symbols. And I think, you talk about Thomas Jefferson or Abraham Lincoln, or non-people like the white picket fence or the frontier, things like that. And I read a lot of the backlash as a fear that those things are being destroyed. And I was curious if you thought that there were new symbols or people that are kind of primed that could lead us to kind of a different future, or if even just the idea of a symbol. So I guess Martin Luther King being an example where he is now a widely accepted American hero, but only for the content of your character line, right? His whole personality is just that now. And so is it possible to have heroes from a critical lens that don't just become sanded down and kind of banal, or they're new symbols that are worth trying to establish as like a positive vision? Sure, thank you again. This is great. I don't think that we can have symbols that are not cultural signifiers for one or the other. And I think this is the difficulty of the task that we're trying to, that we as a polity are engaged in, right? Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to take a bunch of different types of people, liberals, conservatives, religion, non-religion, different type of religion, gender, geography, right? So like all sorts of different things. Okay, now the question is, can you give them something other than this broad conception of nationhood, right? That around which they can rally
that then doesn't become something that they fight over to narrow, right, and narrowly redefine, right? And so, interestingly, some of you may have seen, is it John Oliver? Yes, right. It's John Oliver who's the comedian who has Last Week Tonight, or whatever it is. Okay, may have seen Last Week Tonight, Sunday night, I think, is when I showed it to my class this past week, where he showed sort of the whole, particularly you said Martin Luther King, the content of the character, and the particular signifier for, right, one particular side of the debate. And the question that it raised in my mind is, what is this going to do now to King, right? So it's interesting to me that a lot of, especially Black cultural theorists, have been writing and talking about Baldwin and less King, right? And I wonder, is there going to be a shift, right, in which, okay, King is now really going to be for understood, identified with one side, but other people, right, are going to be identified with the other. And so I don't know, I'm skeptical that one can, right, you could go to George Washington, what's going to happen to Douglas, to Frederick Douglass, right? What's going, right, and you could keep going and expand, but eventually, once they have currency, then they're going to be fought over. And it's not clear to me that they can remain neutral. And I think that's also what part of the fight is about.
All right, so we have 5 minutes. I'm going to give the 2 audience members questions, opportunity to ask them. And then we have the questions here that you can respond to if you would like on. So Rose, and then that's what we like.
Thank you so much for being here and for being in our class yesterday. I have a question that's actually somewhat provoked by that John Oliver clip you were talking about. One of the things that we see with DeVos and Rufo is a lot of their accusations against CRT are then coupled with a call for more school choice. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on the role of the attacks on CRT playing into an overall attack on public education.
Thank
I'll
you.
say it's related to one of the questions. The person said that Rousseau has openly admitted this was in fact the anti-school choice effort was the second step in the crusade against CRT.
Would you like for me to, we're going to take more? Yes, please.
I just want to back up to your definition or your distinction between CRT and DEI. And my question is, aren't structures people too? I mean, the structures are it's the people that animate the structures, right? It's the people that implement the structures. The structures are theory. So I just wonder how you would respond to that.
Sure. All right. So I'll work backwards. Yeah. I mean, I think, that's great. And I've been trying to give some thought to that and try to say, okay, clearly there's a relationship between individuals groups and institutions, right? And individuals operate within institutions. All right. And then the question is one of about, thinking about, well, what's endogenous, what's exogenous, right? To what extent do we shape individual attitudes by saying, let us sit you in the room and then let's instruct you and tell you? To what extent do we shape individual behavior by saying, here's a rule, here are incentives, right? Here are a set of outcomes that we're trying that are unacceptable. And then now we're going to work backwards to say, how do we structure the institution to get individuals to behave, right? So it isn't that individuals do not matter. The question is, well, how should we think about the racial equity project? So is the primary move in the racial equity project is the education of individuals and the changing of their minds, or is the primary move to create a set of structural incentives and to think about a set of outcomes and to change individual behavior, whether, no matter what, whether people come to believe or not, right? And so that's the key distinction that I would like to push, is that if we think that the major importance of the racial equity project is, hey, let's sit down and educate, then that's going to require one set of resources, especially when we have to make choices. If we think, on the other hand, that we're going to work backwards from the type of outcomes that we want and to restructure institutions, and then and individual behavior will follow as a function of that, then that there's a different set of prescriptions, and if we have to make choices between those two, then those choices, that choice as between those two is consequential, right? So that's what I'm trying to urge. Okay, and then I know that I'm holding you, so I'm going to try to be very quick. Two questions from the Zoom, as well as the question about school choices. Great one. In fact, we talked about this in this very question on my critical race theory class the other day, right? My point there was, I think school choice is an element, is an example, is a particular instantiation of the display of a particular type of power, right? It's not going to be the only thing on the table, right? So one way to think about it is, oh, there's only one public policy goal here, and the public policy goal is school choice. And then once that goal has been achieved, then we move on. Right? My point is, no, that just is one example of the way that powers and resources are going to be distributed. There are going to be many other public policy goals on the table, and one has to think about a much more equitable distribution across many different types of public policy dimensions.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to the audience, virtual and in person, for being here. Hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.